How did I paint all those tiny rectangles? How did I make this plane fly? Some of those questions will be answered in this video, where I converted the Zvezda Russian Sukhoi 27 into a Ukrainian Sukhoi. The most obvious difference is moving the IRST sighting system from the right side to the center of the nose, but aside from the markings, the structure is very similar between the two. To start off, I used a textured paper towel, split it into two pieces since it was kind of thick, then dipped it in PVA glue and water to add some padding to the seat. Kleenex or tissues would work well also. After it dried, I painted and daubed some thinned out light and dark brown colors. After finishing the cockpit, which turned out to be the least frustrating part of this kit, I took a break for the next minute because when I get frustrated with models, I build something else. Like this seahorse from Metalkitor. It's literally got thousands of parts, gears, sprockets, nuts and bolts, and a detailed set of instructions to put it all together. If seahorses aren't your thing, they've got a wide variety of animals and other subject matter to choose from. The instructions have color pictures, there's no paint required, and to be honest, this thing fit together a whole lot better than the Sukhoi I'm building. This kit got me hooked and probably took a solid 10 hours for me to finish. I wouldn't call it hard, but it wasn't an afternoon cakewalk. Just the right amount of difficulty to keep me engaged. This thing was lots of fun, and in the end, my finished product actually looked identical to the images on the internet. I highly recommend checking out their website, and I've posted a discount code and a link in the video description below. After a brief hiatus, I came back to a mediocre fitting fuselage and wings. There was a fair amount of puttying and sanding that went into some of those seams, which I chose not to include at the risk of boring everyone to death. The nose scone also had a poor fit and required sanding. I purchased aftermarket engines from Res Kit, and they delivered a quality product. It's nearly all hidden in the end, but at least I know it's there, and now you do too. I sprayed an all-clad base over gloss black, which is kind of my standard MO these days, and from there I experimented with enamel and acrylic washes and then pigments. I used reference photos and tried to mimic what I saw. In the end, there are many layers of effects, both by accident with the need to cover up mistakes, as well as intended coloration. With the use of pigments, I did not spray a final matte clear coat on these parts so that it would not dilute the effect. The landing gear provided an unexpected challenge. This part just killed me, and you'll notice I even changed tweezers partway through to get a better grip on it. Life is easier when you have the right tool for the job. These are aftermarket resin missiles, and I'd recommend not gluing the fins onto the body prior to painting. They are two-toned with a white stripe, and I broke most of them off while trying to mask them. Finally, I just intentionally pulled them off and attached them at the end. I still broke a few off during decaling, so by the end I was an expert at attaching these things. On top of my Mr. Surfacer 1000 primer, I modeled a variety of dark grays and light brown tones and heavily thinned white paint to make a base layer. Not sure I can see them show through in the end, but I did it anyways. I purchased a masking set for the digital camo. Otherwise, I would have lost my mind. There are 3 main colors in the camo, and the masks must be applied in steps. Painting the dark shades first isn't my preference, and it isn't the easiest, but that's the way the masks worked out. Additionally, it's a challenge to get each shade applied evenly to a point where the pre-shading isn't too overdone for one shade or section, as compared to the adjacent camo color. At this point, I accepted the fact that most of my pre-shading would be covered up and I would have to add some additional coloration with oil paint in the end. The masks were super sticky. They were almost too sticky and hard to remove, but they didn't pull up any of the paint. I had to really wrestle with them to get them off without tearing them apart. I saved all the masks because afterwards there was a lot of touch-up work to do with overspray. The curved surfaces make it difficult to get crisp, distinct lines applied perfectly. Not only can you reapply the masks, but you can also use the negative piece off the masking sheet since the whole thing is a sticker. The engines were painted with all-clad metals, as well as Tamiya clear blue and clear orange. I'll say I was inspired by reference photos, but this did not turn out to be an identical match. In the end, I do think I captured the spirit and essence of what these engines are supposed to look like. I generally start with a light or shiny color and then build up darker shades on top. Here I'm using a thin piece of sponge to spray through, and this gives a random mottled coloration. The pale burnt metal is effectively my base, which I then come back and spray over with a darker steel color. While it's not required to thin all clad lacquers, in this case I did. There were so many layers I built up, not all of which are shown in my video, that I wanted a weaker color so I could go little by little. These paints thin out just fine with cheap lacquer thinner from your local hardware store. The engine nozzles were done with Tamiya clear blue and all-clad steel as the base coats. From there, it is an adventure in masking off individual sections to get the variation from panel to panel. Don't be afraid to redo your redos. That can actually help the multi-layer effect, which makes everything look more realistic and less monotone. My final step was a small bit of oil paint to add a specific reddish tone, which I noticed in some of the reference photos. Yes, I know the piece I inserted is crooked. I fixed that later off camera. This is the best view I could get, looking straight down the engine with the flashlight on my phone. My order of operation here is gloss coat, decals, gloss coat, oil wash, and weathering, then finally a matte coat. These decals went down beautifully, by the way, with the use of microset and microsol. Just after I finished praising the decals, there are a lot of yellow decals on this set which seemed too bright, so I dulled them down with dabbing some oil wash over them and then rubbing it away about 10 minutes later with a cotton swab, leaving a thin brownish film. When it comes to the final oil shading on this plane, I placed dots of oil paint along the creases and select panel lines. No thinner, just straight paint, which I then blended with a dry brush. Of course, there's too much paint here, so I use cotton swabs intermittently to remove the excess. Or I could remove it all if I decide it looks terrible with mineral spirits. That's why the gloss coat is important, because without it, I would have a hard time smearing it around and also removing the excess. I like to deviate from the kit's instructions and save the landing gear and doors and rockets and antennas and other fragile parts until the end. Otherwise, they're likely to break off during the oil wash and weathering process. Even after I place them at the end, they still break off, particularly when I take this to do a photo shoot. For small photo etch antennas and sensors, I'll mark the spot with a pin vise and then use a hand drill to make a tiny hole with the smallest drill bit available so I can poke the part through it and help it grip to the model with a tiny bit of glue. By the time you get all the fragile parts added, this becomes a very difficult model to hold and work on. The final parts that I did attach were the static dissipators and the Pitot tube on the nose. I got to redo some of these parts, of course, when I broke them off as I took pictures. This turned out to be a surprisingly challenging build. Even with the masking set, the digital camo was harder than expected. How do you get each color to be uniformly weathered when you have to mask over it in order to paint the next color? It's hard to do side-by-side comparisons and remain consistent, which is why I used some heavier oil shading in the end. My pre-shading had been lost along the way. The engine exterior and even interior is very unique with the heat staining, and it took quite a few tries to get it to look even just acceptable. This kit in the aircraft can be as difficult as you want it to be, but in the end I think it looks pretty cool. That's all for this one, and I will see you on the next build.